Recording has begun. Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening here, and good morning to folks in Manipur and folks elsewhere in India. Welcome to our first lecture of 2025, organized by ARCLA Manipur. ARCLA stands for Advanced Research Consortium Library and Archives. I'm Maisnam Arnapal. I'm a member of our library and archive, and I'm the host for the day. Today, I would like to introduce my co-host. So far, I've been hosting this lecture series alone. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, our intern, Thoungamba. Thoungamba Naorem, he holds a master's in library science and information from Manipur University. He's an intern at the ARC Library and Archives. He looks after library and archival management. It's been 3 months. And he also works in the communication and event planning department. Additionally, he's also working as a library assistant in the Imphal College Library. So he's holding multiple portfolios at the same time. Um, those of you who have seen the ARC Yearbook 2024, he was the one who designed and edited that yearbook. Now I'll turn it over to Thongamba, who will introduce our organization.
Hello, everyone. First, let me explain briefly what our library is about. Our library ARC, the Advanced Research Consortium Library and Archives located in Imphal, Manipur, was established in 2005 and become a public library in 2022. It has mixed members of different demography, ranging from undergraduate students, PhD scholars, to faculty members across various domains of life, such as humanities, social science, and STEM. It is a vibrant hub of academic, artists, and other professionals who regularly gather to organize a variety of events, such as virtual and person lectures, art workshops, exhibition, and many other cultural events. Our library houses books of various disciplines, ranging from books from ancient manuscripts from the 16th century to the present day. If you are interested in our library and the work, you can follow us on Instagram or by becoming a member by filling a simple Google form. Our library charges only 200 rupees for annual membership. And back to you, Arnapal.
You are muted, Maisnam.
I was saying that as Thongamba just explained, you can follow us on Instagram, number one, and Thongamba is going to drop the Instagram link in the chat box, number one. So many of you have already done that. Number two, if you want to enroll as a member, you just have to fill in a simple Google form and pay 200 rupees, and 200 rupees takes care of a month. What is this? A month's this thing. Okay. I don't know. I guess, hold on. I don't know what something happened. Rahul, can you see me? Oh gosh. Rahul?
Yeah, I think something is happening on the Thoungamba screen.
Thongamba screen. Thongamba. Uh, okay. Sorry. Is it better now? Sorry for the
Yeah,
technical glitch. Yeah. So we have dropped the Instagram link and the Google registration form link, so you can use that and join our library. And now let me introduce our speaker, Rahul Sen, who I happen to know for a really long time, for almost 10 years. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Tufts University, Boston. His areas of interest include psychoanalysis, queer theory, literary studies, and cinema studies. His dissertation focuses on the question of literary and cinematic forms and its interaction with idioms of desire. Rahul's writings have appeared on several national and international journals, news portals, and websites. In 2023, he co-edited a book, an anthology of short stories and visual arts and visual works, right? It was titled Queers in Quarantine, um, an anthology of fiction, nonfiction, and artwork. by queer artists and authors from around the world. This introductory lecture on psychoanalysis will focus on the importance of language and the practice of close reading that we all, as literary and cultural studies scholars, we are trained to do. This lecture hopes to demonstrate the various points of departures and convergences between psychoanalysis and the clinical practices of ego-psychology. Thank you, Rahul. Now I'll turn it over to you, and I'll also make you the host so that you can share the screen.
Thanks a lot, Arnapal. I will share the PowerPoint in a minute, but
Sure.
Before that, I just wanted to start by thanking all of you for joining us today to think and engage with psychoanalysis on the 26th January morning. So I'm really thrilled and honored that all of you are here. I also want to thank Arnapal for inviting me and asking me to deliver this talk. And this is not a very thematically driven talk because Arnie wanted me to focus on certain introductory tenets of psychoanalysis. So what I'm going to say and what I'm going to present in the next 45, 50 minutes or so will touch upon the various milestones in psychoanalytic theory, discoveries of psychoanalysis and stuff like that. So instead of a full-fledged paper, I have designed this presentation more like a classroom lecture of sorts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you over through some of the basic tenets of psychoanalysis, mainly focusing on Freud and Lacan. And then I had shared a brief handout before. So if you have that, it's great. If you don't, that's also fine, because I'm going to refer to a few handouts and a few texts once I'm done with the presentation. So, one of the things while designing this presentation, I realized that it's kind of extremely difficult and hard to sort of summarize all of psychoanalysis in 50 minutes. So when I will talk about psychoanalysis, I'll mainly be focusing on Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, and I'll be talking about each of them very soon, but just wanted to say that I'm using psychoanalysis almost like a shorthand here to refer to these two thinkers primarily. So as all of you have seen that I've titled my lecture Psychoanalysis and Reading. And primarily it is because I am a literary studies scholar and I approach psychoanalysis as a student, a scholar, a teacher of literature. So I'm not approaching psychoanalysis from the perspective of a clinical practitioner or a mental health scholar or researcher. I'm coming to psychoanalysis from the point of view of literary studies, and that's my forte, and that's where I'm trying to. That's the POV that I'm going to primarily hold on to. But there is another reason why reading is an operative term in my title, in the title of my presentation, and that is, as this lecture will hope to demonstrate, that psychoanalysis as a discipline places an enormous amount of importance on language. So language is almost crucial in the way psychoanalysis is imagined as a discipline and practiced as a therapeutic method. So it places an enormous amount of importance on language and the ways in which we use language, the ways in which we respond to language, and the ways in which language can be interpreted to understand the symptoms of a person. In other words, the psychoanalyst and the literary studies scholar, both of them perform the similar task, and that is, they work with language to make sense of the world, and they work with language to also understand when language refuses us disallows us to make sense of the world, which is almost to say, when language betrays us to express ourselves, to understand ourselves, to realize ourselves and our emotions fully. So that is the similarity between the psychoanalyst and people who do closed reading or literary studies. So that's the point that I'm going to hold on to for the rest of my presentation. Now, before I go into what psychoanalysis entails, and the significant discoveries of Freud and Lacan, I want to name two individuals who played significant roles in shaping the discipline of psychoanalysis. One is Jean-Martin Charcot, who was a French neurologist and a pioneer, and who also pioneered the practice of hypnosis in curing female patients who were suffering from hysteria. And what Charcot was really doing is, when female patients would come to him with problems and anxieties and all kind of neurotic ailments, he would perform a certain kind of hypnosis on these patients. And these patients would, when they would come out of that state of hypnosis, they'll start to feel better and they'll start to feel well and they'll feel relieved of their symptoms. So what, for example, Charcot would do is that when these patients are in a state of hypnosis, he would give them certain commands, he would give them certain instructions. And when they would recover back or sort of come out of the state of hypnosis, they would start, they'll report that they are relieved of their symptoms. Now, what's really, it's not really, I am at least not interested or concerned about whether this practice has any empirical grounds, whether it is scientific, whether it has a rational basis. That's the debate for the clinical practitioners to sort of take up. What I'm really interested in, okay, so this is Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, and I'll talk more about them in a minute. But before I actually want to, before I sort of start talking about Freud, I wanted to give a picture about the milieu. Okay, I think there are some people in the Zoom room now. So, before I start to talk about Freud, I wanted to give a picture about the milieu. And there are four major thinkers. If you take a look at their dates closely, you will realize that in the 19th century, there are these four major thinkers who are really sort of giants in their own fields. One is Karl Marx, who was born in 1818. One is Friedrich Nietzsche, who was born in 1844. Freud, who was born in 1856. And Saussure, who was born in 1857. And if you take a look at their dates, you will see that they are all overlapping in terms of the scholarship that they were producing at this time. Now, one of the major things about these four thinkers is that there is something common about all four of them. And if this was a typical classroom, I would sort of ask my students to take a guess as to what is common among all four of them. But I will save you the pain of that. So I'll just sort of say that if you try to think of these four thinkers in this way, that all these four thinkers are sort of challenging the idea of an authority figure, challenging the idea of having a central authority or a central figure as a figure of authority. So Karl Marx, for example, wants to overthrow people who are owning the means of production and want to disperse it among the masses, right? So that's the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx is famously proposing. That means the production should not be owned by a select few, but it should be owned by the masses. Friedrich Nietzsche, among many other things, is most famously perhaps known for his declaration about the death of God. And the death of God for Nietzsche is technically also the death of an authority figure, or a master signifier that kind of holds everything. After Friedrich Nietzsche comes Sigmund Freud, and Freud is, of course, you will see it in a minute, how he is posing a threat or a challenge to the idea of a master signifier. So I'll not talk about Freud right now. But after Freud, the figure of Saussure is very crucial, because he is one figure who is absolutely indispensable to psychoanalysis, in the sense that Saussure presents a theory about language where language seems to lose all its meanings and connotations that it had until that point. Because Saussure sort of says that language is basically a system of signs, and SIGNS, signs, and each sign can be broken down between a signifier and a signified, right? So the signifier is a voice or a sound image, and signified is the object that it denotes. So if I'm saying, it is kind of easy to understand signified on a Zoom screen, because if I call out someone's name, if I say Arnapal, my sound, what I'm producing, is the signifier. And if Arnapal responds from there, who is sitting behind the screen, is the signified. So the funny thing about Saussure is that he's not just presenting a theory or a system of language, but he's also talking about the arbitrariness of language, which means that there is no logical reason as to why CAT should mean a four-legged animal, that is a cat, right? A cat could have been called by any other name. So if you think about like it in this way, that all our regional languages have a word for cat. So that animal cannot, there is nothing singular about language. There is nothing monolithic about language for which that animal should just be known by that particular word. So like how all cultures, all regions, all languages will have their own word for that particular thing. So there is some kind of an arbitrariness about language. So if you go to a French person and if you ask them to identify a cat, they'll probably do that in French language, which an English language speaker might not understand, or which any of the Indian languages speaker might not understand. So there's an arbitrariness about language. So all these four thinkers, philosophers, critics are therefore challenging the idea that what we take as monolithic, or what we take as a master signifier, does not quite exist. Now, the reason I gave a picture of this milieu is that we are going to focus just on Freud and see that what his thinking has got to do with any of this. Okay, so the first thing, if, for example, Nietzsche was talking about the death of God, if Karl Marx was saying that means of production should be redistributed to the masses, if Saussure was talking about the breaking of language between signs and signifiers and the arbitrariness of it, the first major discovery that Freud is doing, Freud is proposing, is that the human mind, what we consider as our human mind, is not a singular thing. The human mind is not one monolithic singular entity, but the mind is made up of three different structures. And I'll take a look at all three of them very soon, but as of now, just this, that he proposes a tripartite, a three-part structure of the mind, where the mind is divided between an ego, an id, and a superego, which is a conscious mind, an unconscious mind, and a superego, which is mediating between the two of them. After this, so he kind of dislodges almost the authority of ourselves. So we don't own our minds, but our minds are controlled by these different invisible factors that are out there. The three other developments sort of following that is one, the Oedipus complex, which is most well known, and Freud is probably notoriously sort of well known for that. So even people who have not really read Freud know that Freud is someone who proposed the Oedipus complex. Besides that, you have his great discovery of dream analysis and how dreams can be used to sort of understand how the mind is structured and how the mind is working and operating. And finally, you have the discovery of the death drive, which is again a very crucial aspect related to the unconscious, which will come in a minute. Now, these are, by the way, Freud has he has written enormous number of books. He has written too many great texts beside these four things. For example, his work on the uncanny, on the horror, his work on mourning and melancholia. So there's just too many great things about him. These four, I think, are absolutely indispensable because in many other works, he refers to all four of them. So there's no particular reason as to why I selected only these four, apart from the fact that in his other works, he kind of refers to these quite a significant bit.
Bro, I was just thinking of laughter. Freud has also written works on laughter, right?
Yes, yeah. He has a whole book on jokes and their relations to the unconscious. And he has a whole theory on laughter, comedy, joke. And yeah, that's again a very significant text. Yeah. I wanted to start with the first. I mean, the three-part structure of mind is actually not something that Freud. This is not an early Freud, by the way. This comes sometime when Freud was in his mid-career. But I wanted to start with this because I feel this is a good point to enter Freudian, theories. And he's of the opinion that the human mind that we can think of or we can imagine is divided or can be divided into three parts. So there are three sort of areas in the mind which really make who we are or how we think and stuff like that. The first is the unconscious mind, a mind that we are not conscious about at this moment. But that part is very much within us at this particular moment. I'll just explain that in a minute as to what that means. You have the ego, which is the conscious mind, which is right now all of us here on 26th January listening to Sigmund Freud, right? This is our conscious mind. We are in this room. This is a mind we are aware of. This is a mind we know what's going on. This is a mind that we are in control of. So we can control our conscious mind. The superego is basically all societal rules, norms, regulations that tell us that this is what you should do and this is what you should not do. So let's say, for example, right now, while listening to this, presentation, if any of you want to, chat amongst yourselves, you will possibly not do that. And that's why you have muted all your microphones here, right? Because your superego tells you that this is an etiquette that I should follow. If I'm in a meeting, I should not interrupt another person. That is the work of the superego. So the superego is basically all the rules, regulations, civilization processes we grew up with. Which dictates our conscious mind. So our conscious mind is sort of guided by the superego. The unconscious mind, on the other hand, is constantly attacking the superego. It's constantly attacking what the superego is trying to impose on the ego. So let's say, for example, hypothetically speaking, on 26th January, we are all here listening to Sigmund Freud. But let's say at one point of time, you lose track of whatever, of your mind. Or let's say at one point of time, your phone rings or a message comes on Instagram and you start to look at your phones and you completely lose track for 5 seconds that you were listening to this lecture. You get engrossed on the phone. And that is precisely because the unconscious mind has taken over the conscious. The unconscious mind has taken over what you think you had control over. So even if the ego is something we can control, the unconscious in Freud, which he calls the id, is that which is enormous. It can at any point of time break and shatter the ego. So that's the reason if you take a look at the picture that I have put on the side, the ego is really a very tiny part of our mind. A lot of it is governed by the id. Now, this is why I said that I'm going to arrive at this point a little later when I was discussing Charcot. Because if you think about Charcot's patients, when they would be put under hypnosis, Charcot would give them some instruction, and what they would recover from hypnosis, from the state of hypnosis, they would be miraculously cured. The only reason for that is that a large part of ourselves, and this is the core Freudian essence, I would say, or a core psychoanalytic essence, I would say, that psychoanalysis holds on to the idea that we are not in control over a large part of ourselves, that we are not in control over how we think, the way we think, the way we feel, the way we respond to feelings, etc., etc. So that is really the sort of radical discovery that that Freud makes, is his discovery of the unconscious, is his idea that there's a large part of our mind that we do not know, that we cannot access, that's hidden from us, and yet something is so powerful that it can at any time take over the ego. And you will see that there are different iterations of the unconscious in all the subsequent slides that I'm going to show you. So after the three-part structure of the mind, I wanted to focus on the Oedipus complex. And the Oedipus complex is also linked to the unconscious, but it also uses the unconscious in an interesting way. So what he's proposing in the Oedipus complex. Now, as you can see, the name is derived from the ancient Greek play by Sophocles called Oedipus Rex. And to put it like in 2 lines, this is a play about a young boy who was born in the kingdom of Thebes. And when the child was born, a prophecy was made by the famous prophet in the kingdom, who says that this child will commit an incestuous crime and he will go on to marry his mother by killing his father. So the queen of this kingdom gets so anxious and so scared that he sort of gives away the child. He lets the child float because she wanted to really prevent that heinous crime from happening. Now, cutting the story short, who can change fate? Yeah. So, sort of Oedipus one day has been, so in the meantime, Oedipus has been taken over by a group of shepherds, and they are sort of raising him, bringing him up, etc., etc. And one day he meets an old king on his way, and a confrontation happens in which he kills the king without knowing. 18 years, 17 years probably have passed without knowing that this king was this person's father. And he thinks that, oh, he has killed a king. He goes off to his kingdom. He now marries the queen because that was the ritual. Whoever is going to kill the king is going to come and marry the queen, and proclaims himself to be the king. Until much later, a plague breaks out in the kingdom, and no one knows why the plague has afflicting the kingdom, until it was discovered that the plague is afflicting because a heinous crime has been committed, where this child has married the mother and has killed the father. Now, this play becomes of crucial importance to Freud. Freud, by the way, and this is also the reason of me saying towards the start of my presentation that Freud kind of, or psychoanalysis rather, emphasizes a lot on reading, language, etc. If you read Freud, you will see that he continuously borrows or references to literary texts. So there are references to Shakespeare, there are references to Greek plays, there's references to Moses, there's a reference to Leonardo da Vinci. So continuous references to art, culture, etc., to propose his theory. And this is the most well-known probably example. So Freud proposes this idea based on the story of the Oedipus complex, proposes this idea that every child's first object of erotic interest is the mother. And now society, the superego, right, will not permit this kind of a relationship. So the superego comes in via the figure of the father to tell us that, hey, you can't do this. You can't just go and establish a sexual relationship with your mother because that's a taboo. Incest is a taboo. And by instituting the taboo, the child is cut off from the primary object of the erotic interest. So in this particular story, in this particular framework, there are three figures. It's almost like a love triangle, right? There are three figures. There's the mother, there's the father, and there's the child. The child desires the mother, but father comes in between and breaks that desire, interrupts that desire. As a result, the child develops intense feelings of hatred and jealousy, rivalry for the father, negative feelings. And eventually through a process that gets normalized. Now, whenever I talk about Oedipus complex, many people raise this question that what happened about women? Because Freud's primary example is a male child's desire for the mother. If you read Freud's essay on female sexuality, if you read his subsequent work, Freud will tell you that even for a female child, the primary object of erotic interest is the mother. It's only after a certain point that the object gets exchanged and the father is substituted by the mother. And if, for example, that substitution does not happen, then there are too many complications, and we won't get into a lot of those details because we won't have time for it. But Freud does take into consideration the desire of the female child or of the woman as well. But just this point, what is really standing out for us is that if we take this theorization as something that has to offer us, it is this, that our very first object of erotic interest is left unfulfilled. Now, since that is left unfulfilled, we try to satisfy that unfulfilled erotic interest from other objects and other things. So you will oftentimes hear that, particularly Indian culture, it's full of these references. The nation is imagined as the mother, right? So we oftentimes call nature as the motherland. There are multiple cultures which will worship nature as the mother, right? So mother nature, motherland. Now we have our primary desire for the mother has been left unfulfilled, so we couldn't fulfill it. And therefore, we need to fulfill it in some ways. So culture has invented this other forms of the mother figure from which a similar libidinal satisfaction can be drawn. So it can be the nation as the mother, it can be nature as the mother, it can be, even people finding at a very banal level, people finding similarities between their partner and their parents. So you will oftentimes hear in dating cultures, people will say that, oh, there are categories of pornography called MILF, or there are categories of pornography called DILF. And all mommy issues and daddy issues are coming from the Oedipus complex, right? So when you hear of the term sugar daddy, or when you hear of the term sugar mommy, you will know that it has its roots back in the Oedipus complex. That these figures, the daddy figure or the mommy figure, these are extremely eroticized figures, and they are offering us something libidinally which can be taken back to our primary desires, which were left unfulfilled and unsatisfied. Now, this is like a very, I should say, it's an injustice to explain Oedipus complex in like 5 minutes, because it's a complicated terrain, but this is primarily what it does. There are subsequent works being done on Oedipus complex. Slavoj Žižek, for example, has written a lot on the Oedipus complex, following Freud, Lacan, and stuff. But if any of you are interested, that can be, I can give you some leads, or that can be a separate conversation. So this is like the basic ground of the Oedipus complex. After that, after the Oedipus complex, the next text that really stands out, which Freud thinks is his most important discovery. He thinks that the interpretation of dreams is his most important body of work, because nobody up until that point in which Freud was writing this, it was published in 1900, had studied dreams significantly, or had taken dreams as an important object of analysis. So Freud was really the first one who was studying dreams significantly as an important object of analysis, because Freud believed that dreams allowed us access into the unconscious. The unconscious for Freud is not something that can be accessed. The unconscious for Freud is something that is, there's a barrier to access the unconscious, right? And that's why it is the unconscious. Dreams are actually something that can allow you to access the unconscious. So in your dreams, and that's the reason we can't control our dreams. Dreams control us. You can't tell that I'm going to dream this tonight. We don't know what you're going to dream tonight. Oftentimes we don't even remember our dreams, right? So we can wake up thinking that, oh, I remember only a part of the dream, but not the entire dream. So all of that is because dreams are the domain of the unconscious. And here we have a text which Freud thinks is his most significant text, his most important discovery, and that is the interpretation of dreams. It is a huge text, which is not just gives you accounts of his clients and patients and the way to read dreams, but the text is much more complicated. Like, for example, we didn't go into the details of this text. Freud says that there are two ways in which you can think of dreams. One is condensation and the other is displacement. Condensation means that, let's say, on that particular day, let's say you had a fight with your partner, and you came back home and you had a glass of apple juice and you really loved the apple juice, etc., etc. And in your dream, you might see that you are having a glass of apple juice that falls from your hand. The glass falls from your hand. That's an example of condensation. So the fight with the partner and the apple juice kind of come together, and that which you enjoyed has been ruptured. So things coming together in dreams, diverge elements coming together, condensation. Displacement is, on the other hand, another process of dream where, let's say, you had a fight with your partner, and in your dream, you see that you're fighting with your, father or mother or whatever. And you see, this is how the Oedipus complex again comes into play, right? Or let's say you bought a very nice piece of shirt, which is, let's say, red in color, and you can see in your dream that you bought a very nice pair of red shoes. So this is the process of displacement. So there are different ways in which Freud lists out dreams, but basically he thinks that this is his most significant work, and most significant work because it allows us access to the unconscious. So his sentence is that dreams are the royal road into the unconscious. So this is the road through which you enter the unconscious mind. And after that, even though Freud thinks that interpretation of dreams is his most significant discovery, I believe, and this is my intervention input as a psychoanalytic scholar, I think beyond the pleasure principle is his most significant discovery. I think beyond the pleasure principle is something that completely changes the way, not just in which we view ourselves, but the way in which we view the world. And you will see that, I don't know how much you'll see that in this talk, but I'll try to bring it back to beyond the pleasure principle in various ways. Beyond the pleasure principle is actually one text. As you can see, 1920. Think about what's going on in the world. The First World War has already happened. Um, this is a time which is post-World War. So the world is kind of ravaged, sort of almost wrecked with destruction and everything. And in that time, this is also a time of heightened anti-Semitism, right? Freud himself is kind of almost, very soon he'll be thrown out of Nazi Germany. He'll come to London and he'll settle there and stuff like that. That's like socio-historical context. But to me, it's very significant that it is in that moment that Beyond the Pleasure Principle comes out as a text. And what is Freud's core argument in this text? Freud is saying that all of us have two instincts that work within us. One is the erotic instinct, the erotic principle, or the life force, which pushes us towards doing good things for us, for the world, etc., etc. You can, for example, you can say that, oh, I'm going to be very productive today, and I'm going to, if you are a student, you can say, I'm going to write 2,000 words, and I'm going to do everything that's going to make my life good, etc., etc. It's a life force. And then there is another force, there's another impulse or instinct working within us, which is completely antithetical to the life force. And that is something that Freud is calling the death drive. Now, the death drive is not literally death. It can be literally death, but it's not just literal death. It is thinking of death more in metaphorical terms, where death stands for devastation, destruction, everything that works against the life force. So let's say your life principle, your pleasure principle, or your erotic principle is telling you that I'm going to write 2,000 words for my whatever article today, or I'm going to do this good thing for this particular person, or I'm going to help the disadvantaged and the downtrodden and going to do something good for them, etc. That's your life force. On the other hand, you have something called the death force. And the death force will disallow you to do precisely what you have wanted. So let's say you start to write 2,000 words, and suddenly something comes up on your phone where your friend texts you that, oh, let's go and watch a film today, and let's go and have some fun. No matter how much you planned and prepared, etc., something about that message is going to be so tempting that it's going to take over your planning and preparing and your life principle. So that is beyond the pleasure principle. That is the death drive. Now, this is a very basic example of the death drive. The death drive can be more deathly, more fatal. So let's say, for example, we have seen in a lot of Bollywood films how, for example, for the sake of love, people are, doing everything that would put their own life and situations at risk. People are doing everything that would jeopardize their chances of success. And those are rather more deadly examples of the death drive. That the death drive really sort of shatters whatever the life principle kind of prepares and plans. So beyond the pleasure principle really is a very classic example. Now, there is one particular example that I wanted to cite in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is an example that Freud himself uses. And that is, he talks about his own nephew, who was really a very small child at that time, who was Freud's grandson, actually, sorry, not nephew, he was Freud's grandson. And Freud notices that this particular child, who's probably 18 months or something like that, if I'm not wrong about the age, has a typical practice of playing, right? So whenever this child's mother would sort of leave the child alone and would go to do some work or whatever, the child would have a woolen ball in his hand to play with. And the child would throw this ball at a distance. And when the ball would disappear from his sight, the child would develop some kind of a anxious expression or some kind of a panic. And he would say fort. Fort means gone. And then he would pull the string again, and the ball would appear from wherever it was back into his sight. And he will smile again and he will say, da. So Freud would call it the Fort da game. Da means there it is, it's there. It's German for that. So the child would repeatedly throw the ball, ball would disappear, the expressions of the child would change. It will be fear, anxiety, panic, and then the ball would reappear and the child would smile again. And Freud sees that this child has this habit of doing this over and over again. So he would throw the ball, he would get it back. He would throw the ball, he would get it back. And Freud kind of uses this example in this text to say how, for example, even when we know that there is something that's going to cause us distress and anxiety and panic, we keep repeatedly doing that thing because it simultaneously offers us a source of enjoyment. And that is the most significant theory that he's proposing in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that beyond the pleasure principle lies the death drive. Again, like the unconscious, we do not have control over it. It controls us. And that is the reason if any of you smoke, you will realize that in India, every packet of cigarette comes with a disclaimer that smoking kills. Nobody cares about those disclaimers, right? So what if it kills? We enjoy having it, so we are going to have it. So even if something that is detrimental to us, there is a force of enjoyment that makes us forget about those detriments. Let's say somebody is diabetic and they know that eating too much sugar is going to cause them health complications, and yet they would not be able to resist if a bowl of ice cream is placed before them. So these are small examples of how the death drive works in our everyday life, or how the death drive works in our day-to-day functioning and day-to-day sort of working through the world, through our feelings, through our emotions. I'm going to. I thought that it would be useful at this point to take a look at the handout that I had shared, but if you have that handout in front of you, that's works. But if you don't, you can go and take a look at it later. I'm going to paraphrase that for you nonetheless. It is actually a very brief case study that Freud sort of recounts. And it is the case study of a young girl, an 18-year-old girl called Katharina, right? The reason why I chose this case study is that you will see the workings of all the things that we talked about right now in the case study. So what happens in the case study? Freud talks about this young girl called Katharina. And Katharina is sort of she lives somewhere in the hills. And what Freud mentions is that Freud goes to the mountains for a vacation, just wants to spend time alone. When he goes to the mountain, there's this young girl called Katharina who approaches Freud and tells him that, "Are you a doctor? I really need to talk to you." And Freud says, "Yeah, I am a doctor. How can I help you?" And Katharina tells that, "I am experiencing this symptom where I'm really sort of suffocating, choking on things, etc., etc." So I'm going to share the screen with you and read out a tiny bit from that section. Let's see how can I share this screen. So,
Yes.
yeah, so you can see this is like I'm just going to read out some extracts because you will see how psychoanalysis really works in practice. In the summer vacation of the year 1890, whatever he's not mentioning the year, I made an excursion into the Hotel Tavern so that for a while I might forget medicine and more particularly the neurosis. I had almost succeeded in this when one day I turned aside from the main road to climb a mountain which lay somewhat apart and which was renowned for its views and its well-run refuge hut. I reached the top after a strenuous climb and feeling refreshed and rested, was sitting deep in contemplation of the charm of the distant prospect. I was so lost in thought that at first I did not connect it with myself when these words reached my ears. Are you a doctor, sir? But the question was addressed to me and by the rather sulky looking girl of perhaps 18 who had served my meal and had been spoken to by the landlady as Katharina. To judge by her dress and bearing, she could not be a servant, but must no doubt be a daughter or relative of the landlady's. Coming to myself, I replied, Yes, I'm a doctor, but how did you know that? You wrote your name in the visitor's book, sir, and I thought if you had a few moments to spare. The truth is, sir, my nerves are bad. I went to see a doctor in L about them, and he gave me something for them, but I'm not well yet. So anyway, I'm just skipping this particular paragraph. Well, what is it you suffer from? I get so out of breath. So this is the point where the girl starts telling Freud that what is afflicting her. I get so out of breath. Not always, but sometimes it catches me so that I think I shall suffocate. This did not at first sight sound like a nervous symptom, but soon it occurred to me that probably it was only a description that stood for an anxiety attack. She was choosing shortness of breath out of a complex sensations arising from anxiety and laying undue stress on that single factor. You see, this is where close reading comes in. That when Freud asks her that what is it that you are suffering from, she's like, uh, I feel like as if I'm suffocating, I go out of breath. Now, it is unlikely that when you are experiencing anxiety attack, you are probably experiencing a host of symptoms. You're probably suffocating, you're running out of breath, you're perspiring, you're sweating, your heart beats faster, and too many things happen at the same time. But this girl is choosing this one thing as the symptom and telling and sort of emphasizing this over and above the other things. And that really catches Freud's attention. And this is where the idea of free association comes in, because Freud kind of follows up with questions on this particular thing. Sit down here. What is it like when you get out of breath? It comes over me all at once. First of all, it's like something pressing my eyes. My head gets so heavy. So you see one thing then leading on to other things. It comes over me all at once. First of all, like something pressing my eyes. My head gets so heavy. There's a dreadful buzzing, and I feel so giddy that I almost fall over. Then there's something crushing my chest so that I can't get my breath. And you don't notice anything in your throat? My throat squeezed together as though I were going to choke. Does anything else happen in your head? Yes, there is a hammering enough to burst it. And don't you feel at all frightened while this is going on? I always think I'm going to die. I'm brave as a rule and go about anywhere by myself into the cellar and all over the mountain. But on a day when that happens, I don't dare to go anywhere. I think all the time, someone's standing behind me and going to catch hold of me all at once. So I won't continue, reading this, but just wanted to give you a sense as to how free association works as a principle. Now, about this particular case, what really stands out, and if you have taken a look at it, you will know this already. If you haven't, you can take a look at it after this. You will see that this particular girl, what happened was that she one day accidentally saw her uncle having sex with her cousin. And when she saw that, she was really startled and perplexed. And since then, the anxiety attacks started happening. Now, upon discovery, when she is relaying this to Freud, she's continuously saying that, yeah, and then later this uncle sort of got divorced from the aunt, and none of those are really reasons which have been vexing me. So eventually it's discovered, or this girl sort of tells Freud after 2 or 3 sittings, that this uncle with whom she sees having sex with her cousin also made sexual advances on Katharina, unwanted sexual advances. So one day when she was sleeping, this uncle kind of comes and presses himself against her. So it was an unwanted sexual advance. It was a sexual assault. And this girl at that point of time was too young to realize this as a sexual assault, but realizes that there is something that has happened to her which is not good. So these are the words through which she sort of reports this to Freud. And much later in analysis, it will be revealed that it is actually not the uncle of the girl, it was actually the girl's father. So the girl's father was caught by the girl having sex with the cousin, and the girl's father had made unwanted sexual advances on the girl. And those were the two set of instances, narratives that he presents to Freud. And this case was, this is a very brief sort of case study. It was a successful case because Freud was able to relieve her of her symptoms. But this is not the reason why I kind of also talked about this. I want to take you to one particular moment in the case study where okay, so here, Freud says, so when she had finished her confession, I said to her, I know now what it was you thought when you looked into the room where the girl saw the father and the cousin having sex. I know now what it was you thought when you looked into the room. You thought, now he's doing with her what he wanted to do with me that night and those other times. So when the girl saw the father having sex with the cousin, the traumatic memory of the father making unwanted sexual advances on her comes back to her. And that's what starts the whole fling of anxiety attack, panic attack, everything. That was what you were disgusted at, because you remembered the feeling when you woke up in the night and felt his body. Free association comes in. So one thing leads on to the other thing. It may well be, she replied, and that was what I was disgusted at, and that was what I thought. So the girl confirms Freud's reading. Tell me just one more thing. You are a grown-up girl and know all sorts of things. Yes, now I am. Tell me just one thing. What part of his body was it that you felt that night? The night when the father makes unwanted sexual advances on the girl. But she gave me no definite answer. She smiled in an embarrassed way, as though she has been found out, like someone who is obliged to admit that a fundamental position has been reached where there is not much more to be said. Now, what I find very interesting in just these, few sentences is that while on one hand, that is actually a moment which sort of rattles the girl, and she's wrecked by it, she's traumatized by it, she's so much so that a series of anxiety attacks starts happening. Yet, when she is being asked that what is it you felt that night, she is embarrassed. She is left with no answer. She even has a smirk on her face, as Freud is mentioning here. Because that particular moment, even if that girl knows that, so you see the superego comes in, the incest taboo comes in. Even if she knows that it is something that should not be enjoyed, it is something that is prohibited and a taboo, she clearly recalls that moment with a sense of smile. And that expression, I think, has got a lot to do and a lot to say about what Freud calls beyond the pleasure principle or beyond the erotic. When we identify something as disgusting, yet we are so attached to it that we cannot disarticulate ourselves from that entirely. I don't know how much time I have, so Arnie, do you?
Just to interrupt you, there are a couple of people in the waiting room who got logged
Oh,
out because of some glitch, and now they're waiting to rejoin. Just see,
oh,
you've completed
how
like
to?
almost an hour.
Okay,
I don't
cool.
know. I do want to explore the Lacan as well, because
Uh,
doing that would take longer, huh?
yeah,
Or you
so
can just.
yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
I can actually because I think Lacan would take a bit, so I'll just maybe have one slide on him, and I can conclude by talking about Lacan. So I don't know if I've added the rest of the people in the room. Um, so with that, I mean, I kind of sort of I would conclude with the major psychoanalytic discoveries of Freud, and I didn't want to speak more on Lacan, but just wanted to, because Lacan is of course much more complicated and would require probably just an entire talk on him. But I think it would be any talk on psychoanalysis would be incomplete without referring to Lacan and at least the three discoveries that he's making. He comes after Freud, and he's a post-Freudian, but he calls himself a Freudian. And like Freud, who had talked about the id, ego, and the superego, which were the three parts of the human mind which Freud invents, Lacan talks about the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real are the three parts um, of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is not really identical to Freudian psychoanalysis, but in some ways kind of relate to one another. So, very quickly, what is the imaginary? The imaginary is basically the realm of images. Lacan is of the opinion that all of us carry an image of ourselves in our mind. We think that we are this person. We think that this is who I am, right? So I might think that I am someone who knows a lot about psychoanalysis. I might think that I'm someone who knows some things about literary studies. I might think that I'm someone who knows XYZ things. So each one of us have a sense of imagination, a set of images about ourselves in our mind. Not just about ourselves, about other person too. So I have a set of imagination about Arnapal. I have a set of imagination about people I know. So that is the imaginary. It is the realm of images. Now, what is very significant for Lacan is that he's of the opinion that all of these are what they are, images. Images are not reality. Images are not what is the actual, but images are always a representation of the actual. Hmm? And Lacan has this whole essay on the mirror stage, on the mirror image, where he's of the opinion that when a baby is brought in front of a mirror, the baby doesn't know that it is his or her reflection on the mirror. The baby is being told that that is you. And the baby takes the image of itself as its own image. And as you can understand that the mirror is really metaphorical in Lacanian imagination, because a child can go to school, and if the teacher tells the child that you are an intelligent child, the child takes that as an image of themselves. If the teacher tells the child that you're a stupid child, you're an idiot child, the child will take that image of themselves. And it is not just a child, it can be anyone, right? So that's the reason why, if someone whom you care about a lot, value about a lot, comes and tells you that, comes and disappoints you in a certain way, you cannot take the disappointment or if you're hurt, because that is not the image of them that you carried in your head. So we are surrounded by images, but the unfortunate part is that those are images that we tend to think of as the real, and not the real in the Lacanian sense, but reality. Uh, Followed by that is the symbolic order. And the symbolic order is the order of language. The symbolic order is the order of signifiers, what we are talking about towards the start of our presentation. that we are surrounded by language. We are surrounded by a world of signifiers. I cannot talk to you at this moment if I do not have access to language. You cannot talk to me at this moment if you do not have access to language. Whatever you see around you, whatever you can name, is the order of the symbolic, or we are all part of the symbolic order. And Lacan is also of the opinion that you cannot change really the symbolic order because you are born into it. We are not agents of change of the symbolic order. Rather, the symbolic order is what controls us. We cannot really escape it in any kind of ways. The real is the most difficult part to grasp in Lacanian psychology, psychoanalysis, but the real is also at the same time that very thing which is thought of as a hole in the symbolic order, a gap in the symbolic order. So what I was telling you when I was discussing Saussure, that there's an arbitrariness between signs and signifiers. Lacan is of the opinion that the symbolic order has a void, has a gaping hole that cannot be fully bridged. And one perfect example of that is, let's say you tell something to somebody and they completely misinterpret you and fails to understand or grasp you, right? So imagine all the fights that you have ever had with your boyfriends, girlfriends, partners, all the fight that you have ever had with your parents. And every time you say that, I could never imagine that you could behave in this way. I never thought you would tell this to me. Now, these are the moments of the real. We thought that we would have access to their symbolic order. But in those moments of crisis, the real comes up and it exposes the break and cracks in the symbolic order of meaning. So the real is basically that which, for Freud, would be the unconscious mind, which cannot be accessed, but which is very much a part of our reality around us. So for Katharina, for example, the case study that we read, she smiled at the end and there was nothing left for her to say. She's like left without words, right? That is the moment of real in the exposing the crack in a symbolic order. So those are some of the basic tenets of Lacan. There is, of course, a lot more to him, which I'm not going into. As I said, he himself is like a gigantic figure, and there's one can just talk about him endlessly. But he has other concepts like the obshipetita. He has other concepts like, the gaze, and there's a lot to Lacanian psychoanalysis. But I thought that the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, these three things are really the fundamentals of Lacan. And we cannot imagine having an idea of Lacanian psychoanalysis without these three things. So I would stop here today, and I would like to, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, I would like to hear them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you,
Rahul.
Rahul. Yeah,
Hi,
go
Rahul.
ahead. Go ahead.
I am Roshni Guruarivam. So
Hi.
you have beautifully answered all my questions regarding Oedipus complex. They have been lingering in my mind for so long, as I have asked my brother Arnapal about regarding that matter. That I'm so thankful that this lecture is conducted, and it is sort of interactive, and I'm very thankful, and it is interesting. So I would like to ask you that from a psychoanalytic point of view. So how do psychoanalysis helps in interacting? I won't say patients, but how do they approach Oedipus complex, people with Oedipus complex?
Mhm.
Or some sort of treatment process or anything, whatever that can be done from a psychoanalytic point of view for people who have Oedipus complex or Electra complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that is my
I
question.
also wanted to add one thing to what Roshni has asked, By the way, Roshni is a doctor herself, so the question is also really crucial to me. And we have talked about like Oedipus and Electra complex in the past. But I was also thinking that we call it complex because it's something to be resolved, right? Does it happen that at certain point in life that we find ways? I mean, it seems like we all find ways to resolve the Oedipus complex by replacing the father figure with a mother figure with somebody else, sometimes replacing the father figure by somebody else. We're always trying to find substitution for this this complex number. But what happens, it's a complex after all. So is this resolvable, or what happens if it doesn't get resolved? Yeah.
Mhm. Thanks, Roshni, for your question, and I'm glad to hear that you found it useful. I am not, I mean, as I said at the start of the lecture, that I'm not a psychoanalyst or a therapist. So it would be kind of audacious on my part to say that how it can be resolved in a clinical setting. So I would hold myself back from saying it, but to add to your point, I would say that, or rather kind of taking the clue from what Anupal just said, that if you read Lacan more, and I think he has an answer to your question better, he would say that the Oedipus complex can never be resolved. It is not something that ever goes away. But to use a psychoanalytic term, it can be sublimated in the sense that it sort of attaches itself onto some other object, and one learns to live with it. And the examples of Oedipus complex that I gave, like, uh, obsessive attachment to the nation as the mother, or an obsessive attachment um, to a mother goddess, or obsessive attachment to any other form of figure, are ways of sublimating the Oedipus complex. Now, in a clinical setting, oftentimes, to go back to your question, what happens, and this is my experience as somebody who has been on the psychoanalytic couch, I can say that I think different modes of therapy have different ways of addressing the question. So psychodynamic therapists, for example, would point this out to the patient and would probably bring them to a realization as to where their anxieties are coming from. So, one of the thing about the Freudian case studies is that there are some case studies which have failed, like Dora, which is the most famous case study. There are some case studies which Freud have been successful, like the Wolfman, or this one that I shared with you. And in all the case studies, there are some references to this primal incestuous fantasy that Freud talks about. And when these are brought to the patient, of course, our primary reaction is to deny that no, we don't have any incestuous fantasy. We don't participate in these tabooed things. But those negations are precisely what Freud would hold on to, and would say that these are workings of the unconscious. Because the moment it brings you to an uncomfortable fact, the unconscious immediately is like, no, this is not the case. It will turn your attention away from it. But I think psychoanalysis is useful in the sense that it repeatedly will draw your attention to the way in which this unconscious drives are controlling. So the Oedipus complex can be just one example of it. There can be multiple. I mean, as you mentioned, the Electra complex is also a very, very crucial aspect of it. So that can be another way. So I think the setting of the clinic or the therapeutic setting can bring the person to terms with these different kind of strategies strategies, these different kind of rubrics that structure our mind in some ways.
So it's funny that I was introduced to this term when I was in class 8 by an English teacher, actually an English ma'am who, after I think the poem was written by Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Ozymandias. And she shared that Percy Bysshe Shelley, it's a personal thing, but he also kind of suffered from Oedipus complex. So I was very like in the very early stages of my life, it was introduced to me. Not after I haven't learned this out just after I came into MBBS or not like that. I was very like it actually helped me in my psychology classes that the teacher asked me, what do you know about Oedipus complex? And since I was introduced to that term very early in my life, and it was quite helpful. So I find your lecture today very interesting. Thank you so much, Rahul.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roshni, for your amazing question. Rahul, we got two questions in the chat box. Somebody was asking, you beautifully presented about Oedipus complex. Would you also share some insights on the Electra complex? That's number one. And number two, can you say something about our repressed emotions?
So are these two? Wait, I can't
Yeah,
somehow.
can you see the chat box?
Yeah, I can't see the repressed emotions question. I can see the
It's right below that. Right below that, Tanushree has
okay,
asked
okay,
about
okay.
repressed emotions. So there are two questions, two different questions. Yeah.
Okay, so about the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex is that Freud, by the way, does not name the Electra complex as the Electra complex. Freud names Electra in one of his essays. I'm a little unsure if it's the essay on female sexuality or if it's a subsequent essay on civilization and its discontents. But in one of these texts, he mentions Electra. So Electra complex is more like a pop psychology term that came in to substitute the Oedipus complex, sort of as a complement to the Oedipus complex. But what is really significant for Freud and the post-Freudians is not so much about whether it's an Oedipus complex or whether it's an Electra complex. But what is really significant is the primal incestuous fantasies that we have. And the primal incestuous fantasies, whether they're directed towards the father or towards the mother, that thing is really non-significant. What is significant is that our primal incestuous fantasies are always left dissatisfied. So they can never be satisfied. And Slavoj Žižek has this idea that even if a child has sex with the father or the mother, it's not as if the complex will be resolved, because the complex is more about thinking of the mother as an idealized figure of attachment, thinking about the father as an idealized image. And I think this is where Lacanian psychoanalysis becomes useful, because Lacan is saying that the imaginary is precisely what will always be left dissatisfied. You can never achieve the imaginary. It's an image that you have in your mind. It's an image of another person that you have. And no matter how much you strive, you can never fully, conquer the imaginary. That's a weird metaphor to use here, but that's what I can think of at the moment. So the Electra complex is really, the Electra complex or the Oedipus complex, they are really suggesting here not so much about father, mother, or this kind of figure, but the incestuous fantasy, or the fantasy for be at one with the primary object, is always a dissatisfied fantasy. It's a fantasy, it's not reality in some ways. So that is the thing about the Electra or the Oedipus. If you are interested, you can read Freud's essay on female sexuality. It's a very interesting essay where Freud is also saying that how, for example, our attachment to playing with dolls, and oftentimes when so many of us played with dolls I have played with dolls a lot when I was a child. And when you played with dolls, you would often pretend the doll to be your child, and you would dress the doll up, you will doll someone up. And those, for Freud, this recreational fantasy where you want to become the mother figure, where you want to become the father figure almost. Freud did not write about G.I. Joes, but I also used to play with a lot of G.I. Joes and action figures when I was a kid, and would recreate hypothetical scenarios about people coming and attacking and killing. So all of our fantasies at that point comes into play. So you can take a look at the essay on female sexuality, which is very useful because Freud writes about these different kind of things about the female child particularly. if you want to know more about the electrocomplex. And to respond to the question on repressed emotion, repression is actually one topic I did not touch upon, but Freud has written a lot on repression, especially in two books. One is Civilization and Its Discontents, and the other one is, what's the name of the other text that, where he writes a lot on incest as well. But anyway, I can't remember at the moment, but
is it taboo and totems?
Yeah, totems, totems
yeah.
and taboo, or taboo and totems,
Right,
something like that.
right, yeah.
Yeah, so that is the other. So these are the two books where he has written extensively on repression. And repression, in the way we understand it in today in 2024, is not what Freud was imagining when he was writing this. So repression for Freud is not entirely a bad thing. And why is it so? Because repression for Freud is the work of the superego. Freud tells that all of us as human beings are, by the way, extremely animalistic, and he's of the opinion that human beings are capable of doing unimaginable harm and devastation and bad things. So all of us need to go through a civilizational process through which we can become better human beings. So let's say, for example, when we are walking down the street, if we have the urge to pee, we would not just start peeing there, right there. We'll probably wait for a toilet, or we'll probably come to our house or wherever and pee, right? So we would excrement is one of the primary ways in which civilization works, in which repression works. So you repress certain urges because you have gone through a civilizational process. Now, repression becomes, however, a problem when it is not falling under the ambit of civilization. So let's say you have a repressed fantasy for your mother. Oedipus complex is also a prime example of repression, right? You repress your desire for the mother, you repress your desire for the father. And in those cases, repression comes out through other ways. So for Katharina, the case study that we looked at, she was repressing the fact that her father made unwanted sexual advances on her. And so much so that the repression manifested itself, articulated itself as, what should I say, what Freud calls anxiety attack or panic attack and things like that. So repression is therefore a broad thing in Freud. And at various points in his work, he defines repression, engages with repression, but it is not something which has a uniform meaning. It is not just repression, but it has multiple meanings across his texts. I think there's another question. How does this unconquerability of this imagined or primal ideal of the mother or father image of the nation or even the human equality play into a larger politics of social justice? I would say that I think the best example that Freud would probably have for your question is the letter exchange that happens between Einstein and Freud after the World War. And there are three letters. So Einstein writes a letter to Freud asking, why is it that, this is after, around the time when the Second World War is about to happen, around the time when Freud is out of Nazi Germany, he is in exile in England. And at that time, Einstein writes to Freud saying that, why do you think human beings go to war? Despite knowing we have one world war already happened, there's another about to happen right now. So why is it that people are after so much of devastation and everything? And since you are a doctor of psychology, Einstein writes to Freud asking for his reply. And Freud eventually replies to Einstein, and it's a beautiful text. It's a very short text, so it's easily accessible and you can take a look at it. And Freud is of the opinion that, yes, it's true that, humans know that there will be all this devastation, destruction, decay, etc., everywhere. And yet, the urge to destroy or devastate for humans is far more than the urge to restore and revitalize and create. And he does not take a moral position in making the distinction. He says that humans are constituted in a way where our primal instinct is to completely consume the other. You know, Jacques Derrida has a book called Archive Fever, where he talks about Freud. And Derrida is he's very into this idea, the relationship between the self and the other, and what the self and the other can sort of open up. And he is of the opinion that as long as the self sort of prevents itself, resists itself from completely consuming the other, there cannot be a stable social relation or what you are calling social justice. So the self has to renounce itself as self, which is to say the ego or the conscious has to sort of submit itself before the other if one imagines something like larger politics or social justice. But the trick thing is, psychoanalysis will tell you that it's humanly impossible to do that. We can at the most sublimate, but we can never completely give up on the ego, which is to say that we can never completely give up on the self. And that's the fundamental problem of the human. And I'm going to give a banal example. Let's say there are two non-governmental organizations which work for a particular cause of social justice. Let's say farmers, or let's say, whatever, women's issues or women's rights. And you will see that both of them are sort of working for the same cause, yet both of them have so much, what should I say, rivalry, jealousy, envy between one another over, let's say, funding, over, let's say, who gets more fame or who gets more popularity or who gets more press coverage, right? So, and this is a very, very common trope you will see all around you. And this is precisely what Freud would say, that how, for example, the death drive or what is beyond the pleasure principle would come and take over our conscious mind and all our desires to do good for society and good for us and good for everyone. So that's how the two things are related. And I think psychoanalysis has a lot to say on these particular kind of things. And I think the recent critical theory about Afro-pessimism and negativity also shares a lot on the relationship between social justice and psychoanalysis.
Yeah, Rahul, I just wanted to you have said, you have shared so many things, but just to summarize, one, of course, Freud is emphasizing the fact that it's very important to study our childhood, right? I think he uses the word infantile sexuality. It's very important that, and it's also something as we grow, we realize that our childhood matters more and more. We always go back to those moments in childhood, those pivotal moments in the childhood, those profound memories there, or whatever, certain significant events that shape the way we are, right? Our social and political consciousness and so on and so forth. And I think reading Freud is very important that way. The entire stages of our childhood are formative years, and determines a lot in terms of who we become, what we become in later life. Number one. Number two is the tension between the pleasure drive and the death drive, just push and pull, and that's always going to be there. And you have explained, you have given a very interesting example of these two organizations, but they believe they don't believe. I mean, they're actually working for social justice, but has huge differences in something that we see, and also not. I mean, and third one is also not to see things in black and white all the time, right? We often tend to see things like, the bottom line here is things are not always black and white, always good and bad and right and wrong, right? And there are always these gray areas and yeah. So I mean, how it complicates, how it adds layers, the way how we read things, how we interpret our social realities. But I was just thinking in terms of how whatever you said, everything could be just kind of, help us, like our childhood, our reality, yeah, these binaries that we all blindly follow. Yeah. I would also like to invite if other people have questions, comments. Rahul and I, we talk all the time. Whenever I have a question, he's always the consult, but I would request other people if you have a question. It could be the most basic. I know there are many people in this group who are here, I'm like actually listening to a lecture on psychoanalysis for the first time. So if you have anything, that you wanted to ask, please feel free to use a mic or the chat box. Kiamba, he says, ask, how does Freud's idea of self differ from Asian philosophy, dismantling the
That's a very
spiritual?
good
Okay.
question. That's a very good question. There's actually a lot of writing on Buddhism and psychoanalysis. But unfortunately, I am not in a position to answer it because I know about psychoanalysis, but I don't know much on Buddhism. But I know that not just Buddhism, but a lot of spiritual schools or beliefs would actually talk about the dismantling of the self, in the sense to reach the level of moksha or nirvana. And you should correct me if I'm wrong. You need to renounce the self, right? You need to give up on the self. And it's very interesting to see how the two schools might interact with each other, because psychoanalysis is very clear on this particular ground that the self can never entirely be renounced, because a large part, as I also was trying to refer to it, a large part of what we think of as the self is also hidden from us. So we do not entirely have control over ourselves. And what I find very interesting about your question, but also largely about this debate that's already kind of existing, is that the idea of dismantling the self is also something which is coming from the self. It's also something that it's a foregrounding of the ego. So there is a paradoxical push and pull already ingrained in the question itself, when the self wants to undo itself almost. So as long as there is an active desiring subject who wants to give up on the idea of the self, that is in a way sort of revealing the psychoanalytic principle that how much of the self we can actually control or how much we can actually give up. I can't answer more on what Buddhism has to say on it because I clearly have no idea about that. But if you have more idea, I mean, if you have something more to add to that, I'm very willing to, listen to it.
Thank you for the
Hi.
thank you for the go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you for the response. I have been practicing meditation for quite some time, and so this question comes to my mind because a lot of these practices is based on the idea of dismantling the self. So I was just curious, and so I thought like maybe you might have something to say on this. But thank you for sharing.
Yeah. No, I mean, as I said, this is actually a very interesting question, and especially people who are into spiritual practices. There are works, by the way, on Buddhism and psychoanalysis. I really hope someone who has like a good grasp on these two things can comment on it, because I clearly don't. So,
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, I think the idea of self is actually, it's interesting to see that how the idea of self presents itself in different religious schools. Because different religious schools have their own imaginations of dismantling the self. So Buddhism might talk about, reaching a nirvana. Um, you know, certain schools of Hinduism would talk about detachment. and say that, we have to give up on the self in these kind of worldly attachments need to be given up on. So I think the question of self dismantling operates in multiple religious schools, but how it relates to psychoanalysis, specifically to your question, would probably be best answered by someone who has some grasp over spirituality, which sadly I don't.
Okay, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, dismantling the self, Rahul. I was thinking that I always think of self like there'll always be a self where you think in self at the individual level or communal level or whatever at different levels. That's number one. And I don't think self. I mean, this is just my personal opinion. Okay, this is not to challenge any particular school. But the self can always be remade, and we are always engaged in this act of remaking, reconfiguring the self in many ways. But can we completely kind of dismantle it? It's also something that I was thinking of. But talking about, you just mentioned about Buddhism and certain schools of Hinduism talk about detachment and all. I was thinking of Sufi. Because some of the core, I mean, not that I'm an expert or whatever, but some of the things that, some of the songs, for example, in Sufi is about complete dissolution of the self, into the divine power, or even your object of love, right? Like sometimes you completely forget who you are, and I was completely immersing in someone, could be the spiritual slash your lover or beloved, whatever you call it. And I was also thinking using love and desire, and spiritual eroticism as a way of dissolution of the self, right? I mean, yeah, I was also thinking in those ways. I don't know if you do, I mean, you do teach uh, Sufi and desire. So I don't know if you want to say something more
Yeah,
on
no,
this.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of Sufi and Bhakti, literature foregrounds this principle of the loss of completely losing oneself. But I think Sufism and also like Bhakti poetry, they do it slightly differently. And right now, the example that's coming to my mind is the famous Qawwali by Khusro, which is Chhap Tilak Sab
Like,
Chheen. Now, if you
yeah,
think about that, those two first opening lines, it basically says that all my identities, all my chhap and all my tilak has been taken away by the beloved who is in front of me. Now, that is a loss of identity more than a loss of the self. Because if it would have been a loss of the self, then there wouldn't have been a desiring subject in the first place. But the speaker in that particular poem is saying that my identities are all gone. So I don't know if I'm Hindu or Muslim, I don't know if I'm man or woman. So all these different boundaries and borders that constitute ourselves are sort of frizzling out. But the desiring subject remains because there wouldn't have been a beloved without the lover. So I would think of that more as a dissipation of identity rather than a dissolution of the self.
thank you for that distinction. Yeah. Anybody else who has a question? We can take maybe one last question, Rahul. It's been almost 90 minutes. So hi,
Hello.
go ahead, Nico.
Hi. Hi, Rahul. Thank you so much for this amazing lecture. And thank you also to the ARC Library for organizing this talk. I'm sorry if I'm not very audible or lucid. It's almost
You
12:30 in the morning for me,
you are
where I
Saniko.
am.
Can you please introduce yourself like in one line? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So hi, I'm Cynical. I'm a PhD third year student at McGill. I also work in literary studies, which is why everything you were talking about, symbolic language, and close reading, that is literally my bread and butter at the moment. So this has been great. I think I was listening to everything about the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex and all this conversation about cultural reading, and that made me think a little bit about the Yayati complex. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of, condensation and displacement that we do in psychoanalysis and how we're looking at symbolic language to interpret these larger cultural understandings, right? So as much as we talked about Oedipus complex and the Electra complex, I was curious how distancing from, say, the spatial or the temporal context of whatever, whether that's a case study, or whether that's a literary object of analysis, like how that plays into our interpretation. And I guess for anybody who might not be familiar with the Yayati complex, I was bringing it up because to me it's more pertinent in, say, the larger context of in Asia, where there's a lot of like at least it figures as a literary trope, right? In a lot of folk tales where you have the children sacrificing for the parent, which is in reverse of what happens in the Oedipus complex. So yeah, I just wanted to know what you might have to say about that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sainiko. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Is it Sainiko?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
I'm so glad you are here. It's also 12:30 a.m. for me. And I'm also thrilled to hear that you're from McGill, because McGill has one of my favorite psychoanalyst scholars, Bobby Benedicto, who also writes on Asian literature, Asian theory, and he's just great. But I would like to also just add and extend what you just said by saying that there is a beautiful essay called The Indian Oedipus by A.K. Ramanujan. And he kind of gives a long folkloric history, charts it out in the Indian territory. But also, like, there are other psychoanalytic scholars who have written a lot on localized versions of psychoanalysis. So say, for example, Sudhir Kakar has written a lot on the Indian imagination and how Oedipus complex plays out in India. You know, Amrita Narayan has written a lot on the Indian reiterations of Oedipus. I couldn't get into all of that due to the lack of time, but there is definitely a way in which Oedipus complex can be localized within particular cultures and different cultures. Having said that, I would also say that probably for Freud, it would not be so much important as to what name you want to give it, whether you want to call it the Yayati complex or the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex, as I was saying, because all these would signify a catachresis for Freud. Because for Freud, what is really important, and for Lacan too, what is really important is that there is a sort of gap that exists between we as desiring subjects and our fundamental object of desire. And the way in which you present the gap will, of course, differ culturally. So different culture might have different stories about the gap, but the gap remains fundamentally a gap. And Lacan might call it the Obshipetita, Freud might call it the Oedipus or the Electra, or, so there are different names, endless number of names that you can give it. But I think what really matters to these psychoanalytic scholars at the end of the day is that these are ultimately catachresis or just misnomers. So endless number of names can go by it. But I think, there are other kind of criticisms, as you rightly pointed out, also exists. Like, for example, Sudhir Kakar has said that how, for example, in an Indian family, unlike Freud's family, imagination of the family of the Oedipus, there is no one mother figure, but multiple mother figures, because a child is taken care of not just by the mother, but the grandmother, the neighboring auntie, and a lot of other primary mother figures who sort of come in to substitute the one imagination of the mother figure that exists in the Freudian nuclear family imagination. So these are, I think, different ways in which Freud can be sort of taken from his Eurocentric context and localized. But I think, eventually what remains is that what is the way in which one articulates the symptoms that, or well, not just symptoms, but articulates the different hypotheses that he's sort of proposing. So those are some of my thoughts, but I think there's a lot of work that has been, a lot of exchanges of letters that have happened between Girinder Shekhar Bose and Sigmund Freud, on dreams, how to read the unconscious. We didn't, of course, have time to go in there, but a fantastic body of work on Indian contexts in psychoanalysis.
Thank you so much. That was great. I would love to chat more as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Saniko, for the brilliant question and for your participation. We're planning to have another lecture on psychoanalysis, but that will be on Jung, Carl Jung, because that's again, Carl was talking more about non-Western societies. So this will be scheduled sometime in May or June. And Diptangshu Das, who also happens to be our mutual friend, Rahul, you know Diptangshu, right? Who's in Denver. So Diptangshu will again do a talk on Carl Jung. And Saniko, please do join us that time, and we'll also let you know in advance. Now we have one more question, Rahul. I hope this is the last question of the day. And this is coming from our very own Thoungamba, who asked, okay, you can read it out.
How do our ego, superego, and it affect our personality and the choices we make in life? How do we find a balance point between the dynamic interrelationship between these three? Thanks for your question. I think it's a very important question. And the reason why I find this question very important and pertinent is that probably we do not have an answer to this question, because I think if we find a point of balance, as you are talking about, is the moment when all of our lives would be absolutely perfect and dreamy and imaginary and utopic. And the problem of the human is that there is never a balance point to be found. That there are always, like, even the happiest person on this world cannot tell you that there's a perfect utopic symmetry between these three different things, between the superego, the id, and the ego. Because at every point of time, at every moment in life, we are constantly battling these three things. And oftentimes, unfortunately, losing the battle to the id, losing the battle to the unconscious. And that is really the starting point of all our miseries and all our sorrows and all our troubles. And it can be a trouble or sorrow as basic as my favorite psychoanalytic scholar, Jacqueline Rose, will say, not being able to sleep, not being able to fall asleep, even when you are super tired. Now, that is a psychosomatic thing. So it can be something as basic as that, or it can be something more grave and serious, like, anxiety attack, as Katharina was experiencing. But at every moment, we are sort of trying to negotiate between these three things which structure us and constitute us. And I think we cannot find a point of balance, although we might continuously try to go there and reach there. And that's what I think the Freudian school at least will try to say, or the psychoanalytic therapeutic school will try to say, that we are constantly trying to sublimate and negotiate and live through this, but never really resolving and trying to find a balance between this.
Hi, Rahul. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Actually, this was one of those, topic that I was thinking that I would join. And usually what I did on Sundays, like, put down my thinking hat and do all the stupid, silly stuff. But this psychoanalysis topic was something which was like very interesting. And so thanks for this talk. And about that, the thing that you just said, that all the things have we have no control over some sort of things. So I think that is a very good thing, because otherwise, if we started to think that we have all the control over anything, then we sort of then tend to have this uh, cocky nature. And even like when somebody like Modi himself saying that, almost claiming himself as someone very an ethereal figure. So I think that's the beauty of the nature, that we don't have control over all the things, and there will be some lacking on our part as a human. So yeah, that's the only comment that I wanted to say. And really, thanks for this really interesting topic. And I hope to join such kind of a presentation in the times to come, in the coming days also. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I can see the name as Batman, so I don't know
But
what.
that's
Yeah,
Bhadrajit. That's Bhadrajit.
Oh,
that
okay,
was
okay.
something. Actually,
Bhadrajit.
I just changed the name also, but I don't know. It
Right, yeah.
hasn't reflected yet on the console. I guess I can see that my name is Batman still. So that is that.
Yeah. Thank you, Balrajit. Balrajit, it also brings back a memory because Rahul and I were roommates for 7 years in Delhi, and Balrajit was
Yeah.
our neighbor for quite some time. Thank you, Balrajit, for
Yeah.
that excellent comment. We have somebody raising hand. Girija, please go ahead.
Yeah,
Girija?
hi Rahul.
Hi.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes, you
just
are.
introduce yourself
Okay.
in one line. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
So hi, my name is Giriza, and I completed my master's in political science from Delhi University. We had a course named Politics and Psychoanalysis taught by Dr. Saroj Giri in our third sem. So your lecture takes me back to those classes where we were introduced to Freud, Lacan, and then we would always talk, ask among our classmates like, do you get what is the relationship between politics and psychoanalysis? We didn't get it until towards the end of the semester, till we were introduced to like Lacan, and then later in other papers we were introduced to Sudhir Kakar and then Ashish Nandi. So it was really nice listening to you. So it's not a question; I just wanted to share that with you. So thank you so much. It was really fascinating since you also come from a literature background and not from a psychology background. So it was really nice listening to you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for attending it and for sharing that. And I did meet and interact with Saroj Giri at one point when I was doing my MPhil. But yeah, I never knew that he taught a course on politics and psychoanalysis. So it's really good to hear that.
yeah. I mean, there's a whole subfield of political psychology, which is something I started exploring only recently because those of us who study war and conflict, it's really important, right? Yeah, thank you, Rahul, and thanks everyone for staying till the end. Rahul, that lecture was excellent. I wish we had more time to talk about Lacan as well. Because Lacan, I think he uses for 5 minutes, but would have been, I mean, but yeah, and some other day we could do something on Laka as well. And thank you everyone for the questions and comments and for being there. And Rahul, any a last comment?
No, I mean, I'm so glad that all of you joined and stayed till the end and asked and participated. I'm really very thankful to ARC, to Arnapal, to all the organizers for putting this. If you have any other questions, you can always reach out to me. My email, I think, is if it's not there, I'll just put it in the chat box. And yeah, I mean, if you have any questions, if you want to reach out, you can always drop me an email. And
Thank you.
thank you very much. And I hope all of you get to spend a good Sunday, rest of your day. And for whom it's morning, well, good night to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Good night, everyone. And thank you, Rahul, once again. Hope we will be able to host you at ARC sometime in future. I mean, in person. Yeah. All right. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.